I'm pretty excited to do another session on Resource Graph. I'll introduce myself really quickly because the picture is way too big. My name is Wesley Haakman. For any native or non-Dutch speakers, good luck with that. So just refer to me as Wesley. I work at Intercept as a lead Azure architect, and I'm happy to have gotten the Microsoft Azure MVP award just this February. So still pretty excited about that. But you're not here for me, you're here for the content. So let's move on to Azure Resource Graph. It's been around for quite some time now, but in practice, we do see that a lot of people are still not leveraging it, or are leveraging it not enough, or they don't see the use case. And today I want to share that information with you and help you leverage that Azure Resource Graph for your day-to-day work. I use it pretty much every day. And as Microsoft states, it's an efficient and performant resource exploration tool. And what you will see in the demos is that it is actually really, really fast. And if you've been using the Azure portal or if you are using the Azure portal, which I think most of you actually are, the search bar on top of the Azure portal, that is actually powered by Azure Resource Graph. And I think it was implemented last year or the year before that, and you actually saw a big improvement in performance through the Azure portal of the search bar. And even now, the new All Resources page is also powered by the Azure Resource Graph. And if you've been looking at the activity log and you click on changes or change history, you will see a diff between whatever changed for your specific resource. That is also powered by the Azure Resource Graph. I'm going to do a demo of all that. We're going to build some basic queries and then extend that into more complicated queries. Even look at how you can translate that to Azure policy. And we'll definitely deep dive into change history and how you can leverage that and maybe build some automation around that. So first things first, using the Azure Resource Graph, myself, I usually use Azure PowerShell. And if I want to visualize stuff or build a dashboard, I use the Resource Graph Explorer through the Azure portal. That's the exact same Resource Graph Explorer that Thomas just used in his demo. Or you can directly use the API or use the Python, Go, or JavaScript SDKs, or the Azure CLI, if you will. So a lot of options, a lot of possibilities to use that Azure Resource Graph. But it all starts with building queries. So building queries for the Azure Resource Graph, it does look a bit complicated if you go to the more advanced queries, but in its very basics, it's not that difficult. The language is based on the Kusto query language, but it's not the actual Kusto query language. So the Kusto query language, or KQL, if you will, is much more advanced than what you can do with Resource Graph, but it did take some elements from the KQL language and they implemented that into the Azure Resource Graph language. So if you can do KQL, you can definitely do Resource Graph. The other way around, you probably need to deep dive into some documentation. So the very basic query here, you can see it on the screen. What I'm doing is requesting resources and then where type equals tilde or squirrely thing, if you will. Microsoft.storage, the storage account. So what I'm doing here is actually talking or requesting a specific resource provider or a specific resource type. I'm requesting the type storage accounts. It is case sensitive in a way that if I use two equal signs, then you actually have case sensitivity. But if you go through the different resource types, and if you try to translate stuff to the actual Kusto query language, or you actually look into going through to Azure policy using the aliases, then you will see some different use in cases. It's still not standardized everywhere. So I prefer to use the equal sign and the tilde to take away the case sensitivity. And I just mentioned the aliases, and the aliases is actually what you use if you use Azure policy. So if you use Azure policy and you're writing your own custom policy, you're actually using an alias. And the aliases are used to restrict what values or conditions are allowed for a property. But basically, you use property aliases to access specific properties of a resource type. I will show you in the demo what that means. First, we're not going to use any aliases at all. But if you want to translate your your resource graph query. So for example, I'm checking whether stuff is running in a specific location, or I'm checking if a specific property is set. Then it's probably easier to use an alias because A, it's much shorter. You're directly requesting information for that specific property instead of going through all the hoops and through all the queries to actually find that property. Sounds a bit complicated, but I will show you that in the demo. But first, as a first demo, we'll just try and build a really basic, very, very first query. I'm going to start with building the query using Azure PowerShell. Got my console right here. I'll try to make it a bit bigger so everyone can read it. And I'm using the command let's search AC graph. So it's search AC graph. And these queries also translate to Azure CLI, and you can even copy paste them into the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. And if you do that, you just have to take away the PowerShell stuff, probably format it a bit so it looks better than just one single command line. And you can use it in the Azure portal as well. So to start, I'm just going to start a really simple query, and we're going to request that storage account. So the thing you just saw on the PowerPoint presentation on the page is actually this, search AC graph query resources. So I'm requesting from the resources container, and I'll tell you about resource containers or resource tables in a bit. But I'm requesting from resources from this table, and the type needs to equal or needs to almost equal, because of the case sensitivity, Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. So if I request that, I'm forgetting a quote. Yeah. So when I request that, you can see that I get a bunch of information. And at first, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. But now I get all my storage accounts back from whatever subscription I have access to. If I just want to play with one, I can limit it to 1. And I just get 1 response back. So now I have the details from 1 storage accounts. And as you can see, I get the resource ID, I get the name, and I get the type, storage accounts, I get the tenant ID, kind. I get all the properties or all the details from my storage account. So instead of going to the Azure portal, finding that resource, clicking on it, I can actually request that fairly easy and pretty fast, because what you see, I just hit enter and it's there. So there's no loading from a web page or anything. There's no get AZ storage account commandlet that's going to take a while to figure out which storage accounts is going to return. This is really just plain text, really simple, which makes it really fast. But I also have a bunch of other options. So now I'm just requesting the storage account, but maybe I want to summarize the account. So for the experts here, it does look a lot like SQL, but KQL, SQL looks a lot alike. And I'm going to summarize count by location. And now I am returned the location of where my storage accounts are in. So apparently I have 1 storage account in South Central US, and I have 8 storage accounts in West Europe. Still pretty cool. I can extend that query a bit. So now I'm actually going to project the location, total account, and order it by total descending. And you can see that in total, because I'm now querying not just my storage account, I'm actually querying all my resources. And obviously I have 89 resources in West Europe. I have 2 in UK South, 2 in Global. So to link it to Azure policy, so before, or maybe you have a plan to implement a policy that will restrict or only allow you to deploy stuff to West Europe. If you run this query, if you dig into the resource graph, if you dig into what you're actually running, you can see that, well, if I set this policy, a bunch of stuff will be non-compliant. What you can also use this for, which is a really big use case. So let's say you're a service provider, or you work for a company that provides Azure solutions or Azure consultancy. You go to a customer and you want to see what's up, because 9 out of 10 customers that have just onboarded onto Azure by themselves and they're unaware of all the capabilities, and they just did the next finish onboarding thing to Azure, probably through a credit card. They probably have a bunch of resources running all over the place. First thing you want to do is figure out where do you want your stuff to run? Where does your data have to remain? And then explain to them, well, this is actually where stuff is running. This is much faster than actually going to the Azure portal, figure out which resources are running, figure out which location they are running in, and then build a report manually. So for reporting purposes, this works really, really well. But back to that storage account. So let's say we're going back to the storage account, which was 2 up here. And we're going to do this. So now I get all the storage accounts. But maybe I want to know about specific properties of my storage account. So maybe I want to know which property. So let's say a customer tells me, hey, I want to make sure that all my storage accounts are connecting securely. So they need to support HTTPS and they need to deny any HTTP traffic. That's something you can figure out with the Azure Resource Graph. So if you go back to just querying one storage account, which you can see here, I have an ID, I have the name, and I have a bunch of properties. And one of those properties, if we zoom in, if we check it, we see support HTTP traffic only is set to true for this storage account. But maybe I want to know which storage account aren't running the HTTP traffic. So if I search my AC graph and we have storage accounts, and then I'm going to do a project, which means I'm going to project these tables. I want to project this data. I want to project the name of the storage account, probably need the location, and I want to have the HTTPS traffic only. So which is in the properties value. So I'm going properties dot supports HTTPS traffic only. And now we're hoping for no typos, and which we didn't do. So now I have the name of the storage accounts. I have the location, South Central US, West Europe, which matches the count that we did earlier. And the properties support HTTP traffic only, set to true for a bunch of them, but for 2 of them, it's not. So that's something we probably want to fix. And I can even, I now have the name, but maybe I want the resource ID, which I can do as well. Not actually sure if that one, so we can try it anyway. Resource ID. No, it's not going to accept resource ID. So we have to go by the name, and I'll show you it through the Resource Graph Explorer in a bit. Let's get this data back up. But now I still don't know. So I have a bunch of customers here. So these are storage accounts running in different subscriptions and even different tenants. So how do I know which storage accounts or which subscription or tenant ID I have to look in? So we're going to extend that query. And if we go back to the storage account, we can see that there is a tenant ID and there is a subscription ID as well. So if we add that to our query and we hit enter, we can see that now I have the name of my storage account, I have the location. This one is set to true, but I want to know the ones that are false, which is here. So the storage account, West Europe, set to false. This is the tenant, and this is the subscription ID. So now I know exactly where to look. But maybe I just want to have the ones that are returning false. So we can once again change the query. And this is still pretty basic querying, but you can see in PowerShell, the list gets longer. So the more complicated your query gets, I like to do it through PowerShell. But if they get really big, the Resource Graph Explorer, which I'll show in a bit, is much, much easier, much more friendly to use. So now I'm just returned the storage account that have that property set to false, which is the storage account SAChanges 123, which is the one we're using in this demo, and its location is West Europe, and obviously this one doesn't have that property set. Now, if we go to the Azure portal and we find that, I think I already had it here, so SAChanges 123, and we go to the configuration, we can actually see that secure transfer required is disabled. So what we're seeing in the resource graph actually matches what we're seeing in the Azure portal. Another way to get these results, because now I have to click through the Azure portal, is to actually extend that query again. And this is where you will see it does get a bit complicated. We got almost the same query here, But now I'm not just doing the properties set to false, and I'm not just projecting the name and the location. I'm also projecting the property itself. I'm projecting the tenant ID and also the subscription ID. So if I return that, now I know exactly where those storage accounts are that are set to false. Probably want to share that with my customer. Tell them, hey, these are the storage accounts we need to change. Does that mean we're going to publish a breaking change? Will your application break, or can your application that is connecting to Azure storage, is that actually supporting HTTPS traffic only? All right, so then let's look at those aliases, and I'll do it through the Azure portal first. We'll go to the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. We'll look at the alias in a bit. I've got the query right here. But we can actually, just to show the Resource Graph Explorer, do pretty much the same thing, but just copy and pasting my stuff here. But obviously, the Azure Resource Graph Explorer doesn't support the PowerShell commandlet. So what I'm doing is taking away this. And I just like to have a bit of formatting just to make it readable. And obviously, you can do this through PowerShell as well with the right characters, but I always get a bit annoyed by going through a new line in PowerShell. So I just prefer to do it this way through the Graph Explorer. I can run the query, and you can see the results. Storage accounts, summarize, count by location. West Europe, I have 3 resources. This number doesn't match what we just saw in PowerShell, and that's because the search AC graph commandlet in PowerShell is set to multi-tenancy by default, so it goes through all the tenants that you have access to. If you have delegations from a customer that did a delegation through Azure Lighthouse, if you use PowerShell, you will immediately have access to that, even with the Azure Resource Graph. If I select multiple subscriptions here, I just run it, and you can see that I now have a different number, which also matches the one that we had in PowerShell. But we can actually do more than that. And we'll look at dashboarding in a minute, but because I now just have 2 fields, one with location and one with account, I can also go to a chart, select a chart type, and maybe I just want to have a map. And now I have a map of the world. And because everything is running in West Europe, I just see West Europe. But if I select multiple subscriptions, and I'm really jumping ahead of my presentation because I'll talk about multi-tenancy a bit later. But if I select everything, the context changes. I hit run query, and you can see I have South Central US as well, which we saw in the PowerShell commandlet. Now if I go to chart, you can see that I have one running here as well. I can pin that to my dashboard, which we'll do in a bit, and then build my dashboard and see where my stuff is running. That is the initial capabilities that the Resource Graph has. So another use case is if I do a migration for a customer. So probably many of you or some of you have done migrations from Azure Resource from one subscription to another. And if you did, then you know that can be quite painful because not everything is supported for move, and not so a virtual machine can appear to be eligible to move to another subscription, but then there's some specific resource that is not supported. So how do you figure out which specific resource that is, or which specific resource are running? One way would be to go to the resource group, click on the resource group where the VM is in, and then check all the independent resources and even tick the box that show hidden resources. But that's a lot of work. You need to go through a lot of stuff to actually build your report. And then you need to go back to the Microsoft documentation and check whether all those specific resource types are eligible for a move. And then if that's only a move between resource groups or also between subscriptions. So one of the big use cases for Azure Resource Graph that I use pretty much every week is to just request all the resources and then select the type. So now I have an overview of all the resources, and we'll go back to just one subscription here for a bit. I think this one's got more resources in it. Run the query. And you can see that these are the different types of resources running in that subscription. And this actually corresponds with the documentation of Microsoft on moving resources. So the documentation on moving resources is just a list of resources where you can see the resource type and whether it's supported for move, yes or no. So you have the resource provider Microsoft.network, and then you can check if Microsoft.network/network interfaces is supported for movement, or if Microsoft.network/network security groups is supported for movement. This is what I use quite often to actually build reports and double check if I can move a specific resource. So back to the other queries, I've got a more advanced one here, and there's a lot of documentation on that. It's in the sheets as well. So what I'm doing here, and I'm going to the presentation back real quickly because I want to share this sheet before we move on. So what you see me do all the time right now is actually define resources as the graph table that I'm using. You don't actually need to do that. So I start all my queries with resources and then start typing my query. But by default, resources is the graph table that you use. So if you don't define it, you will query the resources graph table. But it is the best practice to actually do define it, as then you always know if the queries get more complicated, then you know where your stuff is coming from, right? Then you also have a table for resource containers, which is pretty much just subscriptions and resource groups. And yes, you do see the subscription ID from actually requesting the resource. We just saw the storage account, and that had a property called subscription ID. And that subscription ID is also present in the resource containers, but that also has the name of the subscription and a bunch of other data. Then we have advisor resources, alert management, health resources, a bunch of other stuff. And this list is still growing. So it started with just resources, then resource containers was added, and now we have a bunch of other stuff. Now, if you go back to the Graph Explorer here, we can see that I'm starting with the resources table. And I'm selecting the storage accounts, and I'm going to join on the resource containers. And what I'm doing is I'm joining on the resource containers. I'm getting the resource groups, and then I'm checking for the tag ARG demo. And if I run it, and it already ran, it's not showing anything because I didn't select the right subscription. So I'm running it again. And now it returns one storage account, the resourceChanges one, because if we check that specific storage account, we can see that it does have a tag environment ARG demo. And what we're doing here, and this is another feature of the query language, what you can see here is got the name, the type, tenant ID. I've got a bunch of stuff, and it's either coming from the resource containers because I joined it, or from the resource table itself. But I don't want to see the values for subscription ID 1 and resource group 1. And this is when I do project away. So instead of just doing the project statement, which I'm doing in this very, I think it was, oh, we got it in PowerShell. So where's my PowerShell window? It's here. So instead of doing the project all this, what we can also do is project everything except for the subscription ID and the resource group 1. And then we get the same results. So another feature here is the formatted results, which I figured out by accident because usually I'm just fine with this. But if you click on the formatted results, it will actually translate a lot of stuff to the Azure portal. So what you see happening is that the ID, the resource ID, became a clickable link. So if I click it, I see resourceChanges123. I can click on it and actually go to that resource. So a resource graph is not only, or anymore, is not just the way to get a list of resources or resource information or properties. No, it's also a way to figure out what you have running, format the results, and move to that specific resource. So what's happening here is instead of going through all that clicking in the Azure portal, Microsoft made your life a lot easier with just this simple button. So back to the aliases that I just talked about. So if we look at the aliases, and we'll start with PowerShell again, what we just did well, pretty much every query is go to properties and then support HTTPS traffic only. But if you have a lot of properties with properties underneath that and underneath that as well, this will become a pretty long list. So for that, well, not specifically for that, it was made for Azure Policy. There are also aliases for specific properties. And if you're going to write an Azure Policy definition, then you will actually use that alias to directly request information from that property. And we can actually get a list of that, of the available aliases. So what we're going to do is search the AZ graph, and then resources again, get the storage accounts, and we just want to have one result because we don't want to have the aliases for all the storage account, because obviously they're the same for every storage account, just the values are different. And I'm going to project the aliases, and then I get a property back called aliases. And if we're just going to open that up like that, you will see that we have a list of aliases with the same values that we can actually get from the property. So if we look at support HTTPS traffic only, which is set to false, so this is actually the same value, but now I'm using an alias. So I'm doing Microsoft.storage/storage account and /support HTTPS traffic only, which is an alias for this property. So that makes my life a lot easier. But if I'm going to write a custom Azure policy, I would actually use something like this to actually check the field. So it will be if any field, and then this would be the content of that field. So if you want to build Azure policies, it's really good to use the aliases. Not every property has an alias. So there are a lot of properties that still don't have an alias, but the most common ones you will use in Azure policy are available as an alias. But also that list is still growing. Here you can see how I am using the aliases. I don't just do it to actually directly because this is not that much more work than just getting the property, but it also helps me to just rename the field I'm using. So I want to know HTTPS only. I'm using the aliases term, and I'm getting this specific alias or the contents from this property. I'm doing the same for the account type, and if I run it, you can see below, I actually have a list with a lot of information on my storage account. So I got the name, I got the kind, I got the type, HTTPS only true, blob encryption true, file encryption true, and the location. So that's looks a bit complicated, but it's just a lot of copying and pasting and figuring out which alias you want to use. And then you just say where the type is, Microsoft.storage/storage account, and then project the name, the kind, the type. And what you can see me doing right here is I really like to have a really clean report because I either want to use it for a dashboard or I want to send it to a customer. So I just format it like so to have some consistent naming in my my reports. I can download it as a CSV and share it. Do pretty much everything I want. So back to the presentation. I'm going to share this one again. So we just looked at the graph tables, built some basic queries or some more advanced ones. But queries do have limitations. So by default, only 100 results are returned. I can upgrade that to a maximum of 5,000 results using the first parameter, but then you have to keep in mind that it pages 1,000 records at a time. So I get 1,000 records back, then I get the next 1,000, then I get the next 1,000. Now, it's also really important is if you're using something like Azure Lighthouse and you want to do queries across all your customers, if you're fetching data from more than 100 subscriptions in a single call, you have to use a batching mechanism. And that's really well documented how you can do that, but it will not return anything if you try to fetch data from more than 1,000 subscriptions. If you're going to run into that, good job. You have a lot of customers, you have a lot of subscriptions, but you need to take into account the query limitation. So these limitations are here. So we also have the thing like throttling, and I'll try to show it through the Azure portal with a dashboard in a minute. It's a free service. So the Azure Resource Graph, you can use it for free. But that also means that if you're going to request a lot of it, a lot from it, then you need to implement paging technologies or batching or anything like that, because you will be throttled and you can only do so many requests per second. It still is a lot, but if you're going to query across a lot of customers, so maybe you have 20 customers and they have 1,000 storage accounts and you're going to query that using the resource graph, then you probably will be throttled if you do it through the Azure portal. But then you need to do something like PowerShell or use the SDK and implement a throttling mechanism. So then we have dashboards, and dashboards, I never was a fan of building dashboards because it feels really static, and Resource Graph pretty much changed that. Resource Graph gives me the ability to do more than just a static dashboard. And you just saw the button pin to dashboard, which actually just does what it says. It pins it to a dashboard. But other than that, they look really, really fancy, and they support multi-tenancy as well. So if let's go back to that. I think it was this one. We had one where we had the location. So let's say we have this one, and we have the chart, and now I have a map, but obviously I can do a bar chart as well, or a donut chart. Pretty cool, but I really like the map. So I have the map here and I hit pin to dashboard. Now, if I go to my dashboard, I have a bunch of other stuff here, but if we scroll down, you can see that I have more access than just the 2 subscriptions. I've got it set to everything. You can see that it's pinned to my dashboard, and it's actually, oh, this is one for all the resources. So I have a query for all resources, and we can zoom in a bit. Maybe it doesn't zoom in that well, but if we go back here, so you can actually see what it looks like with the chart map, and you can see an overview of all the resources. Apparently it doesn't scale that good in the dashboard, but probably some clicking and testing and resizing it will make it better, which it does actually. So I'm done customizing, but what you can see here is that I have more than just that map published to my dashboard. I have the tenant IDs and subscriptions that I have access to as Wesley, and this is sensitive to the subscription picker. So I have a delegation from my test company called Cloud Adventures, and they delegated some resources or some subscriptions to my MSP tenant. And because I selected all that and selected everything, I get the data back, or the aggregated data back from all that. And you can see once I change the subscription picker, or even if I touch it, it will refresh, and you will see that I have tried to zoom out a bit to make sure you can see everything. Got my virtual machines by SKU. So what kind of virtual machines am I running? Apparently I'm only running Windows servers. I can see my VMs by location, which are all running in West Europe. And I can do that for my different services, and even the storage account information that we just built with the Resource Graph Explorer is listed here on my dashboard. Also got my storage accounts by location. So because this is dynamic, that's what I really like. So maybe I want to have an overview of all my customers, or I want to customize that, or maybe just check one specific customer. What I can do is I can do it through this one, the current context, but I just built this to actually see what the context is. If I go to my all my directories, I'm just selecting, I don't want to have that one, don't need that one, and I don't want to have the internal one. You can see it updates. It's going to take a second, and now I'm in a different context, and I've got different numbers here. So this one doesn't have any app services, so obviously I untick the box of a subscription that had the only app services that I was testing. And then we have this here, and this is the throttling I'm talking about. What you can see is your query has been throttled. This tile will retry your query after 1 minute. So this is a pretty extensive dashboard. You probably want to limit the amount of things you want to put in one single dashboard, because now I'm requesting a lot of information, and the Resource Graph returned to me, hey, that's not what we want to do, because it's a free service and you're overloading the API. Now, best subject ever. We started with Azure Resource Graph, and that it supports, or that it powers the change history capabilities in the Azure portal.
Change history goes back for 14 days, and it retrieves the change properties of a resource. So when this just started, it was much more complicated, and I will show you what it looked like at first and what it looked like now. But pretty much I can request the change history through the management APIs or the Azure portal. And I will do that right now. Before we move, let's first explain the change history. So I've got two endpoints. I've got two endpoints for my change history. I've got the resource changes, which requires me to input a body with the resource ID. So for instance, that storage account that we have here, this is the exact same storage account. And an interval, which is the Zulu time zone. So you need to do a bit of converting, which I did in my script. And optionally enable the fetch property changes. And this is the new property or new option. And what it will allow me to do, or what it allows me to do, is request just the changes for that specific resource. And then I post that to the management.azure.com API with the endpoint resource changes. So then what I should be returned is just, hey, this property changed. So if we're going with that HTTPS only configuration, we should see that it was set from true to false. Then we have the resourceChangeDetails endpoint. And this one is a bit more complicated. It requires the resource ID, which we already have, and the change ID. So this request also returns a change ID. And with that change ID and the resource ID, I can actually request a snapshot of the resource before it changed and after the change. So I will actually get the exact same JSON of the resource before my change was implemented and after the change was implemented. And then I can run the diff myself. So when Azure Resource Graph was first launched, this was all we had to do a diff between what changed. So we knew something changed, but then we had to do a diff between the before and after snapshot to figure out what it was. And then Microsoft published the fetch property changes one that will now return us the same information. So this we will just use to have more details or actually have the data of what my resource looked like before I ran through the change. So what does that look like? I have really, depending on what your knowledge is, can be complicated or can be quite simple. I have PowerShell script, which takes a parameter, but we're not going to input any parameters. So if I don't input anything, I have the resource ID, which is the subscription, and the storage account that we just talked about. And then here I have that end time and start time. So what's going to happen is I'm going to request the changes for this resource ID between the start time and the end time. The next thing is just logging in using login AC account, and it will get the token that it needs to query the API. And then I have the body for my resource change API. So the body is on the presentation. I need the resource ID. I need the interval, which I'm grabbing from here. And then I set fetch property changes to true. Then I'm just sending that whole thing to the resource changes endpoint using an info-res method and using the header that we build here and the body that we build here. And then it should return the changes that I did prior to this session, which is actually just setting that HTTPS only from true to false. Some output to make it readable. And what would happen is if I run this, get changes.ps1, it will return that the change property for that HTTPS, for that search account, the before value was true for properties.support HTTPS traffic. Keep in mind that this returns the actual property and not an alias. So it was true and it's set to false, and the change type was an update, so I updated the storage account. If we open the Azure portal for the storage account and we go to the activity log, you can see the same thing visually. So if I click on this, I have the change history preview, so activity log, operation, change history, and we can see what changed, and we have that diff here. So this is also a way to visualize it. But if you want to do it programmatically, if you want to build some automation, then this is something you would use. Then you would use the PowerShell one. This is good for just your initial recognition or your initial research, but then you use PowerShell or Azure CLI or whatever you prefer. Additionally, we can actually request the snapshot itself. So what we're doing right here, and I'll uncomment this. And you can see that I have a new body with the resource ID, the change ID, and then I'm going to request a snapshot by inputting the change ID, which we retrieved from this call. And now if I run my script and get changes, I should get a lot more data, and I do. So this is what we had, change properties, and you can see the change ID, which is the change ID that I got from the previous request. So I go to resource changes to get the change ID, and then I go to resource change details to use that change ID in combination with the resource ID to get my snapshots. You can see the snapshot has an ID. So the before snapshot, it's all in JSON. You can see that this was actually these were all the properties of that storage account. This was the exact configuration. And then afterwards, so here we see, that's why I really like the fetch property changes, because this is really non-human readable if you look at it all day. So there is a property here, HTTP traffic, support HTTPS traffic only set to true. Now, if you go to the after snapshot, and it's timestamped as well, so you can exactly see when it happened. You can see that it's set to false here. So for stuff like incident management, something happened, you need to know what happened, who did it, if you will, but pretty much what happened, what changed. Do I need to revert it, or if you have an audit and the auditor wants to see what change happened, or you had a security breach and this was actually set to false on purpose because someone wanted to insecurely access your storage account, then this is what you would use to request the changes. But keep in mind, it only goes back 14 days. And I think we're coming up on time as well. We just did the demo, and that's my session on Azure Resource Graph. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute or post in the chat, and I will answer it after this when the next speaker starts. Thank you.
I think all was quite clear, Wesley. So,
pretty good. Well, if anyone has any questions later on, just send me an email or hit me up on Twitter. Yeah.
So I think we will have now a short break, and then I think we start around 20:30, I think, with Neil. So if still someone has a question for Wesley, we can still ask, and otherwise we have some time to catch a drink with this warm weather.
All right. All right, so Christian just asked, is it a game changer for you? In what way? So for me, it is all about the speed. The way you can get all that information really fast, and it does have somewhat of a learning curve, but for migrations with customers, get all the detailed information, it's so much faster than going through the All Resources tab. That's the biggest win for me. All right, I think that's it. Thank you.